Hey there, this is Brom Bresenham. I've just finished week 12 of rebuilding Axor the Mighty in the Godot engine. My development rate has slowed down because of a freelance job that I've also been working on. My original plan was to spend weekdays putting in 8 hours on the freelance job and then 4 hours on Axor. That was plausible in theory because I'd been putting in 12 hours a day on Axor, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. However, what I found was that after 8 hours of freelance project, I felt a little too burned out to switch immediately to Axor. Happily, I found a simple solution. I just switched the order of my two projects, putting in 4 hours on Axor in the morning, followed by 8 hours on my freelance in the afternoon. Partly because I'm more passionate about Axor, and partly because it's only 4 hours before I switch context, I'm able to switch to my freelance job with no loss of momentum. And of course, once I've started on it, it's easy for me to put in my full 8 hours there. I've still got weekends devoted to Axor as well, which is great. Here's what I got done in the last 5 weeks. I finished the UI layout for the core game. There are 2 variations of portrait layout, and there's one landscape layout. The layouts switch at certain aspect ratio thresholds, and then adapt to different display sizes between those thresholds. The game view shown in this video is just a placeholder image. I still need to hook up the actual tile drawing in all of the layouts. The window starts in 9:21 aspect ratio, the thinnest portrait aspect ratio used by production cell phones. The user interface has the tall portrait layout. As the window becomes wider, the game tiles become larger and the space available for the status bar becomes smaller. At a certain width, the layout switches from tall portrait to standard portrait mode, compressing the information on the top status bar. The UI adapts as I make the window wider up to a 3:4 aspect ratio, the aspect ratio used by iPad, and the widest portrait aspect ratio used by production devices. The layout then switches to landscape. Landscape layout has a side panel that contains the game information as well as the action buttons. Even though the display technically still has a portrait aspect ratio, I made the switch here for 2 reasons. 1, there's an aspect ratio no man's land between 3:4 portrait, the widest portrait device in production, and 4:3 landscape, the thinnest landscape aspect in production, apart from the 10:9 screen of Game Boy and Game Boy Color. It's unlikely anyone will ever play the game in this unusual aspect ratio range, so it doesn't matter when I switch from portrait to landscape within this range. 2, when a portrait mode display gets any wider than this, the portrait UI quickly starts to have a weird looking layout with small components and big gaps due to the aspect constraints on the status bar components. Instead of making a special portrait mode UI to cover this aspect ratio corner case that no one will ever see, it was simplest to switch to the landscape UI, which could cover this aspect ratio range without any special modifications. From here, this side panel landscape UI adapts to cover any landscape size and aspect ratio. I'll point out a few things about how extra space is distributed. In the portrait layouts, all extra space is given to the top of the screen. While it would look nicer if it was more symmetrically balanced, it's important to keep the action buttons and the arena view near the bottom of the screen, close to the player's fingers on mobile. In the landscape layout, excess vertical space is taken up by letterbox panels at the top and bottom. Those disappear as the arena view reaches its full height. For excess horizontal width, the side panel expands its width to its natural limit, where all components are at their maximum size for that layout. Then a left side pillar box starts growing until it matches the width of the right side panel. Then both side panels expand. The action buttons are aligned with the left side of the right side panel, so that a player doesn't have a big gap between the arena view and the action buttons, as they'll be tapping or clicking frequently in both areas. On mobile, the layouts include safe area margins on the top and bottom. The safe area margins are the unsafe areas where a camera notch or rounded corners could obscure important game elements. Safe area margin values are part of the latest release of my Godot add-on, GameGUI 1.4, available on the Godot asset library or from my GitHub repo. The GameGUI framework automatically sets parameters, similar to global dictionary values, for safe area top margin, and so on. Any GameGUI component can then set its height sizing to parameter, and then use safe area top margin, or bottom, or whatever, as the parameter name. GameGUI 1.4 also introduces a component called GG9patchRect. GG9patchRect replicates the functionality of 9patchRect and adds an additional feature. When the available area is smaller than the size of the corners are scaled down to fit. I'm using GG9patchRects for the level, prize, and high score info boxes. To switch between UI layouts, the ggLayoutConfig object checks the display size and aspect ratio, emits a signal corresponding to which layout should be used, computes the game view tile size and the size of major components, and sets a handful of corresponding parameters used by the UI. The GameView root node listens for the various layout signals. When a layout signal is received that doesn't match the current layout is removed from the node tree, and the appropriate scene is instanced to replace it. Each layout didn't have to be designed from scratch. Many of the UI components, such as the health and energy gauges and the rampage, score, and gold counters, are separate scenes that are incorporated by each different layout. I took the following approach to keep the separate instances of these components synchronized with the same data values. I have an autoload singleton called game that maintains the definitive state of information relevant to the user interface. So game always has the correct score, the correct amount of gold, and so on. Each of those properties has a setter method which sets the value and then triggers a signal called UIInfoUpdated. Each component that displays any of the game state values listens for the UIInfoUpdated signal, and when it fires, refreshes its own state. When one layout is replaced by another, the UIInfoUpdated signal is emitted so that the new components can synchronize their state. A small caveat is that when a layout is about to be replaced, all the existing signal listeners must be iterated through and disconnected before that layout is queued to be freed. Slightly related to all that, but mostly tangential, here's an example of how a good design can require changes when it comes to implementation. In this case, it's game art related. My art team made a very nice panel frame or border for the game. I loved it and implemented it, and in fact I've discussed it in detail previously, and the need to implement it in Godot was directly responsible for the GameGUI add-on I created. I got around to testing the game layout on my iPhone. Here's a screenshot. It looks great as a screenshot with its square corners, but on the actual device, the edges of the frames look weird as they disappear into the curves of the rounded corners. I kept one edge of the top and bottom frames and eliminated the others. Here's how it looks now. Much better. On a final tangent, I'll mention how Photoshop's new generative AI helps me quickly and easily make a major modification to Axor's cover art. My art team gave me just what I asked for, which was a large piece of landscape cover art with the major action happening on the right side so that I could crop that side and use it as the portrait mode cover art. After an initial round of sketches and feedback, this was the final product. I love it, but I didn't realize until later that when the right half of the art is used as portrait mode art, there's no room above Axor's head for a logo or other information. I was just going to make do, and then I saw Photoshop's new generative AI capabilities. Check out some videos. It's pretty amazing, and it really does just work. I set the crop tool to use generative fill rather than a background color. Then I expanded the image height to add a big area on top. I generated 9 total variations, picked my favorite, and then used the lasso tool with generative fill to further touch up that variation. My cover art went from this to this. Really amazing. Photoshop with generative AI is a great tool for game developers. Alright, that's a wrap on week 12. Catch you later.